I am always impressed by the ingenuity of our forefathers, who did so much with so little. We still marvel at their accomplishments today, which they completed without access to either the technological nor theoretical knowledge we possess. It's amazing what architectural marvels could be built before modern engineering, or that someone like Columbus could cross the Atlantic basically on dead reckoning. Relative to us, our forefathers didn't have a lot, but boy, did they do a lot with what they had. I think this is why in the pre modern West, there was such a careful emphasis on right thinking, logical precision, the careful parsing of argumentation, because the power of the mind is really all they had. And so they had to optimize their thinking to ensure that what little they did have was as certain as possible. Think about how you walk when you're barefoot in a dark room strewn with Legos, or when you have to walk over a treacherous terrain like ice. There's a care, an attentive surety to every step. Pre modern people were willing to take a long time thinking a subject out, turning it over, considering it from every perspective, and drawing out its logical conclusions. St. Augustine took 20 years to complete writing his City of God, releasing it in installments over the decades. How many people today would wait 20 years for a man to finish his argument? To use a more modern example, when the founding fathers of this country were drafting the Constitution, they were incredibly methodical in the amount of forethought put into the system. If you've ever read the Federalist Papers, you know what I'm talking about. Now, say what you will about the philosophical and political beliefs of the founding fathers, but you can't deny that there was an admirable degree of patience, circumspection, and steadfastness that went into how our forefathers constructed the framework of government. There was a well roundedness to their thought and an aversion to doing things rashly or impulsively. Politics is the art of life, and government is supremely important in how we attain the good life. It was only natural, therefore, that the architects of our country assumed that its people would put the same level of forethought into their decisions. This was the assumption behind the democratic processes that underlie our republic. Let people argue out their ideas in a public forum so voters can assess the strengths and weaknesses of proposals, and then the open marketplace of ideas will ensure that the program most amenable to the most people wins. It was intended to be government through prudence. But something happened that our founding fathers did not expect. A wrinkle entered into the system in the manner by which our elections were established. Our elections were structured around the principle commonly known as first past the goal voting, which means every election is a zero sum game. 51% of the votes gets you total power. There's no consolation or merit to coming in second or third place. If you are among the 49% whose party didn't win, your vote effectively didn't count. Winner takes all. I personally think a lot of the problems in our political system derive from this principle because it created extremely high stakes for elections. Since there was absolutely no benefit for coming in second or third, political momentum quickly, almost instantaneously, coalesced into two opposing poles, as this concentration would offer a candidate or party the maximal chance of winning. And just like that, the two party system was born. Something that is not in our Constitution and that our founding fathers neither envisioned nor wished for, but which we were saddled with almost instantly. It is a polarity created by the power dynamics inherent in our system that the principles underlying our voting make necessary. The effect of the two party system is that there can really only be two solutions to any policy issue. We've got a binary political system, which can necessarily only offer binary solutions. This has a way of simplifying every issue and debate down to its most absurdly reductivist version. This is because you have to cast all your chips with one side or the other. There's little room for compromise or nuance. And this is evident in our history. You're either pro tariff or anti tariff, pro slavery or anti slavery, isolationist or interventionist, pro war or anti war, pro taxes, anti taxes, and so on. Nuance has to be downplayed in order to keep the message clear. Many politicians with fantastic ideas have nevertheless failed to succeed because of what political pundits call failures in messaging. That is, their proposals were too multifaceted, not reducible to a pithy slogan or soundbite. This was something I learned personally when I was an elected official. When I first got voted into office, I would try to give speeches or make public statements that were very carefully thought out, intellectually nuanced, came at angles from lots of different perspectives. And when I did this, I was so disappointed. The crowds would just stare at me blankly, like they literally didn't know what to think about what I was saying, and it always fell flat. And so quickly I learned that all my statements had to be some variation of "Go team," and then the people would cheer. It was almost like they wanted someone to just tell them what to think rather than ask them to think for themselves. And so American politics got dumber as time went on, but also more polarizing, which was further intensified by our primary system, which ensures that candidates are chosen only by the most zealous, ideologically motivated elements of the two parties. This practically guarantees that with the passage of time, the two parties move further apart from one another and their respective positions become more uncompromising. The only time you really get more than two options is during times of great political turmoil or realignment, like in the period surrounding the Civil War, or during the decade of strikes and civil violence in the age of the robber barons when we saw the rise of the Populist Party, the last time a third party seriously challenged the two party system. Now, even if you don't consider yourself political, politics still affects everything in your life. It affects your employment, the growth patterns of your community, how much money you take home, even the exercise of your religion, as we all saw during COVID. This all has profound consequences. First of all, in our minds, what is the psychological effect on society of being conditioned for decades in a binary political system whose trajectory is increasingly polarized? Well, the trends that characterize our political system start to creep out into all our social endeavors. We go from having binary politics to being binary thinkers, binary problem solvers, people whose very cognitive processes operate entirely within the paradigms crafted by our political system. In other words, the polarities and dynamics that characterize our political system come to shape and then define our entire cognitive world. Have you noticed that public discourse is getting dumber, that nuance is being lost, that people seem increasingly unable to find innovative solutions for our problems, that nobody wants to compromise, nobody wants to understand anybody else, and no matter what we do, everything seems to get worse? I am convinced this is because the binary nature of our political system has expanded and bled out into society at large, even into the very mechanics of our thought processes. So we are increasingly less capable of the patient, multifaceted, reasoned analysis of our forefathers. Have you noticed that everything feels political? That politics seems to be everywhere? To some degree, this is a consequence of the politicization of everything. But I think this goes hand in hand with the fact that the way we think about politics increasingly characterizes the way we approach every problem, even problems that aren't inherently political. It's almost become our society's default setting. This tendency is exacerbated by social media. Social media seems to amplify people's existing ideas and prejudices. It's like taking every crazy thought that comes into your head and giving it a bullhorn. So I think that's why we've seen the problem remarkably worsen over the last decade. The algorithm rewards those who produce outlandish, outrageous content. ensuring it a ready audience. Now, obviously, from a Catholic perspective, this state of affairs is really crippling to exercising the virtue of prudence. We can't exercise prudence if we treat every problem like there are only two possible solutions, or if we are highly polarized and emotionally vested in those solutions, which are almost always ridiculously oversimplified. I believe our public discourse is about to get a lot stupider. I think we're going to see lots of our friends and family, whom we've always considered balanced, well reasoned individuals, start to become positively unbalanced. As I was reflecting on this, I wondered if there was some theory to explain it, and there is. There's a socio-political principle called Duverger's law, which essentially says that political systems structured like ours essentially always wind up where we are now. Maurice Duverger was a 20th century French political scientist who argued that societies with electoral systems like ours inevitably devolve into two party systems where polarization becomes increasingly worse with the passing of time. And there are some studies suggesting that you see more extreme political polarization in societies that use first past the goalpost models of voting. Now, if that's the case, then it's going to be all the more important in the coming years to give deliberate attention to cultivating the virtue of prudence. We are going to have to be as patient and circumspect and well reasoned as our ancestors, but more deliberately so because the current society is moving to discourage free thought. Prudence is a virtue that allows us to recognize and choose the good in the concrete circumstances we encounter. The ancients called it the charioteer of the virtues because it makes all the other cardinal virtues possible. You can't be just or courageous or temperate if you're incapable of even identifying the good in a given situation. Prudence guides the development of these virtues like a charioteer guides his horses. The life of virtue, and by extension, the virtuous society, is impossible without it. I'm worried that we're not only losing the willpower to choose the good, but even the ability to recognize it. I think the reason people are getting increasingly disenchanted with our system is because not only does it seem unable to solve our deepest problems, but even the very options presented as solutions to tackle those problems seem contrived, fake, and managed. There's something in psychology called groupthink, which is the way individual members of groups tend to accept a viewpoint or conclusion that represents a perceived group consensus, whether or not the individual group members believe it to be valid, correct, or optimal. As the polarization continues, it's going to be harder and harder to resist the pressures of groupthink. I'm already seeing this all over, on every side, and you probably are too. This is essentially the opposite of prudence. Now, obviously, a society that increasingly acts less prudent is inevitably going to make increasingly worse decisions. There's a great saying from antiquity: whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. In a society where careful prudence has been replaced by knee jerk groupthink, things are necessarily going to get rough. Our problems are bad enough as they are, but the proposed solutions are increasingly dumb as well. It's like a catastrophic society wide collapse in the ability to exercise prudence or think critically. Can this be resisted? Only with very determined effort. The way we cultivate prudence is by focusing more on the scriptural admonition of being slow to speak. I realize that maybe I look like a hypocrite about this right now by going on YouTube specifically to speak about it, but I think what the scriptures mean by this is to not jump in rashly with an opinion until you've evaluated it from every side, until you've endeavored to truly understand it. There's been so many times in my life, and probably in yours as well, where you looked at a situation and you rashly jumped in with an opinion or a judgment, only to find new information emerge later that made you look stupid. So, Being slow to speak means that we are careful to parse out a situation and analyze it patiently before rendering a judgment. And when we do speak, to speak from a place of wanting to edify, build up, find solutions rather than merely attack something. It is so easy to destroy and so hard to build. When I read the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas, he's incredibly generous to his opponents. Before he gives his own opinion, he offers a realistic, in depth analysis of their own arguments. St. Thomas is unconcerned with merely winning or scoring easy points. He wants to truly understand what the other side is saying so that he can respond to it accordingly. And that's the way we progress with knowledge. And we also have to remember that my ways are not your ways, saith the Lord. Often we delude ourselves into thinking there are only one or two possible outcomes. But how many times in history have things gone in directions completely unanticipated? When I read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm always shocked at how some of President Kennedy's military advisors literally told him that he had no other option beside a preemptive nuclear strike on Cuban missile installations. They phrased the crisis as an either or dilemma. Either you destroy them or you're inciting them to nuke us. Thankfully, Kennedy did not accept this polarity of choice. He opted for a naval blockade, stopping the Russians from delivering any more missiles while putting the ball of escalation into their court. This, of course, caused the Russians to back down and led to the removal of the missiles as well as the nuclear test ban treaty. If Kennedy had accepted the binary options presented by his military advisors, we would have had a nuclear war. But I'm not confident that our own generation possesses the intellectual prowess or autonomy to exercise that same level of prudence, and it's really depressing. I'm not trying to get anybody down or be alarmist, but I do think that in the times ahead, we should recommit ourselves to a calm, reasoned approach to the circumstances of life so that we don't get swept away. We sometimes act as if we are immune from the zeitgeist. We look at other eras of history and marvel at how people could be led to commit such wildly destructive actions, but then we act as if we ourselves could never be so carried away. But the zeitgeist is powerful. It's how Catholic France ended up at the place where they're shoving nuns into guillotines. It takes a special grace to not just get caught up in the passions of the age. And this is a grace we should all be praying for earnestly. Hey, if you made it all the way to the end, I just want to thank you for watching and supporting this channel. Even if you don't always agree with everything I say, I hope you can at least respect that this channel endeavors to be a voice of independent thought in an increasingly noisy online world. I really appreciate your support. And if you value this channel and this kind of content, please leave a kind word in the comments and say a prayer for me. And of course, like, share, subscribe, and all that other good stuff. And I will see you in the next video.